wrap up what we started last week with the mission of Keystone. And if you missed last week, I encourage you to go online to our website, thekeystonechurch.org, and watch it a little bit later, because I'm going to be building off of it today. But just for a short little recap, last week, we talked about the importance of a mission and why it's important to have that mission that is clear, that is easy to understand and to articulate. And we also talked about the importance for organizations and even individuals to have a mission, something that they are centered around in their life, and how from time to time those missions change depending on the station of life that the organization is in or the community that they find themselves in. But beyond being simple to remember as a mission also needs to be able to engage your community for years to come. It's able to help guide you into engaging the world. And our mission comes from what Jesus said. It's about two things in this world. Jesus, if you remember here last week in the book of Matthew, is asked about all the laws in the Bible. And by the way, their Bible, what we call the Old Testament, it wasn't old to them, it was just the scriptures, had hundreds and hundreds, 613 laws written down, and then many, many oral traditions and laws. So in Matthew 22, he boils it all down, and I'm going to share a different version than I did last week with you. Jesus says this. He says, to love the Lord your God with all of your passion and prayer and intelligence. This is the most important, the first on any list. But there is a second to set alongside it, meaning right next to it. It's to love others as well as you love yourself. And these two commandments are pegs. Everything in God's law and the prophets hangs from them. Essentially, love God with all that you've got and love others the way that you would like to be loved. And those two things, everything else within the scriptures can hang on them. So that's what we talked about last week. Beyond that, we talked about how it's important to not just have a personal faith, that our faith is best expressed and lived out with others. So our goal as Keystone is then to just be a community that loves God and loves people. A community that loves God and loves people. And last week, we talked about what loving God looked like. And today, I want to talk to you about what loving people looks like with our mission. Because I am convinced that if we live that second part out, that loving people out, that's what makes a difference in our families and in our communities. That's what makes a difference between making a church alive or just existing. And to better explain this to you, I want to tell you some stories. I'm going to talk about cows and cameramen and Norman Borlaug. That's who I'm going to talk about. And by the way, there's some room on your program if you want to write some things down. You know, on my first Sunday here in 2021, I told you about my personal views when it comes to what the church should be about, and it's about cows. And so for some of you, you may remember this. And in fact, yesterday at the funeral service, there was a family that I hadn't seen in a long time, and she actually quoted myself to me. Wow. And it was like a good quote, but it came from this. Cows. One of the biggest industries in Australia is beef cattle. And one of the big differences between the beef cattle industry in Australia and America is that Australian ranches are much larger, and because of the sheer size of them, they don't have fences around them. It would just be too expensive to fence off all the miles and the miles and the miles of their land. Here in America, we do really well about fencing off and defining our land. So how do you think they keep the cows around where they need to be? Well, what they discovered is that if you dig a well, if you provide a water source, the very basic need of every animal is thirst and water. It is life, especially in a terrain where drought happens often. They've learned that if you build a well, trust me, cows will come. And cows will stick around. It's a matter of attraction that gives them life. They build watering holes instead of fences. Another way that you could look at this is something called bounded sets and centered sets. And now this idea was originally put out there about 30 years ago by an anthropologist by the name of Paul Herbert in his book called Anthropological Reflections on Missiological Issues, which is great nighttime reading. But beyond that, his idea was actually more popularized in another book by the name, written by Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch. It was a book called Shaping of the Things to Come. And essentially what it means is that a bounded set in life is all about fences. It's about boundaries. It's about setting up certain criteria that you either fit within or you fit without. If you believe like I believe, if you worship like I worship, if you, whatever it is, especially around religious circles, then you are in. And if you are not, then you are out. That's a bounded set. Whereas a centered set is not about belief, it's not about fences, it's about orientation. It's about direction. It's about, listen, we do not have to believe the same way, we don't have to worship the same way or act the same way, but let's point ourselves towards the living water. And if we do that, even though somehow, some way we are not the same, which, by the way, none of us are the same, right? We could be uniform around the well, or united around there, centered toward the well, without being uniform in every single thing that we think about. That is somehow a better way to be. And my belief is that churches are supposed to be about wells and not fences. A church needs to be about centered sets and not bounded sets. Not, if you believe the way we believe, then you are welcome, or we will tolerate you until you believe the way we believe. But instead, please come. And let's not worry about getting our beliefs just right. Let's point towards the same well. And as we move closer to that well, we will also move closer to one another. When it comes to how we live out our mission of a church, I prefer to dig wells that people are drawn to rather than fences for them to have to jump over or to keep them in or to let them know they are not welcome. I believe that in order to really love people, our job is not to put out a call that says, come and believe the way I believe. No, it's come and point your life towards the one that I'm pointing my life towards. Belief is important, but listen, it only happens when we move closer to the center, which for Christian churches is Jesus, which brings me to cameramen. So cows, cameramen. 2015, Tammy and I moved to Carl Junction to help relaunch a church there that ironically burned down because of a fire. If you're newer here, you might not know, we had a fire in September. This is my reminder that it was not my fault. But the week before we were to launch and to be open, I spent some time with the local news outlets, and they came out to the property and did video, and about 30 minutes worth of video and asking me questions. And near the end of it, the cameraman who was there turned to me and asked me, "So, Pastor, do you really believe that God exists?" Which I got to tell you, it felt like a weird question. And I think he could tell I thought it was a weird question because I think the look on my face was like, what? I mean, like, really, dude? But he asked me this, and do you really think that God exists? And to which, by the way, I confirm, yes, I do. I was a little shocked that he was asked me. It caught me off guard. Usually pastors are really good about just kind of rolling with things, but by the time I gathered myself together, I said, well, yeah, I do believe that God exists. Why do you ask? Because, pastors, by the way, we always ask people questions. That's what we do. And so he started to tell me about how, he grew up as a kid in the church, and as he became an adult and started to think for himself, he started to abandon his faith of his family, and he started to question and really didn't know if God was real or not. But now that he was getting older and he was experiencing more things in life, he started to have doubts in his disbelief, and he started to wonder, just maybe God is real. And so I told him, I said, I understand that. And it might be hard to accept that God is real. And honestly, standing here, I can't tell you with 100% certainty that God is real because there's so much mystery and things to not fully grasp around God that I might not ever understand. And I can't tell you 100% that God is real because I cannot scientifically prove 100% that God really exists. But what I can say is from everything that I have seen in life and experienced in life, I have no other choice but to believe that God is real. And besides, I told him this, that if I am fully capable of understanding all of God with the limited amount of 3 pounds of brain, sometimes I say 4, and people will laugh at that when they know that we only have 3, by the way. If I can understand it with the 3 pounds of brain floating in my head, then what is the point of God? It was a good 5 minutes or so there with him, and he thanked me for being honest. He said, you know what? Nobody ever said that to me that way. I never expected a pastor to tell me that. He admitted that he was still questioning, and maybe one day he might go back to a church. And so I invited him to our church. In that moment, what I wanted him to know, and I want you to know, is that it's okay to not know if God is real. It's okay to not believe that yet, to still be in this church, to still maybe point your life towards something to figure it out. I believe church is and should be the safest place to come with your doubts and your questions and your unanswered questions and work in a community to figure these things out. We are not here to create fences. We are here to create wells. Pointed towards the one who over 2,000 years ago at a Jewish festival said this. Anyone, not Jewish people, but anyone who is thirsty may come to me. That's what Jesus was telling them. Anyone, not the Gentile, not just the Jewish people, but the Gentiles, anybody, people here, anyone who believes in me may come and drink. For the scriptures declare rivers of living water will flow from his heart. Wells, not fences. Which brings me to Norman Borlaug. Because I think this story here really points to what it means to actually love people. Because you may wonder, how do you love people? Sometimes it's one at a time. How many of you know Norman Borlaug? Excellent. Right here. One guy's heard this. I came across this a while back. This is not original to me. But in 2004, April 2nd, ABC News honored Norman. He was 92 years old at the time. He was their person of the week. Not many people would recognize him, but Norman Borlaug is a man who was accredited to be personally responsible for dramatically changing the world that we live in. Because in the early 40s, Norman Borlaug created a hybrid, high-yield, disease-resistant strain of corn and wheat that was able to be grown in arid climates. Wheat and corn that can be grown anywhere from the Dust Bowls in Africa to the desert Southwest here in America to the plains of Siberia. Borlaug seeds flourished and regenerated in the harshest environments. And at that point, it was calculated that because of his work, Norman Borlaug saved 2 billion, with a B, people from famine. I mean, wow, 2 billion. That's what he was being honored for. And it would be great to be responsible for saving 2 billion people. Am I right? Come on, yes. Some of you are like, well, I could do 2 billion at one. 2 billion. Most of us can't even think in numbers that large, but Norman did. I mean, what an accomplishment. But listen, what if, though, the news report actually got it wrong? What if actually a man by the name of Henry Wallace was responsible for saving 2 billion? Some of you may have actually heard the name Henry Wallace because Henry Wallace served as the Vice President of the United States from 1941 to 1945. And while Wallace was Vice President, he used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico with the sole purpose of hybridizing corn and wheat so that it could be grown in arid climates. And Henry Wallace at that point hired this young man by the name of Norman. So Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but considering the connection, maybe, just maybe, it was Henry Wallace that saved 2 billion people. Or maybe it was George Washington Carver. You've probably heard this name. He's a Missouri hero. If you come from the Joplin area, like my wife and I did, he's well known down there because that was his stomping grounds. Carver was a botanist, he was a scientist, he was an inventor. But here's something very few people know about it. See, when Carver was 19 years old, He was a student at Iowa State University, and he had a professor that knew that he excelled. And so this professor let a 6-year-old boy go on botanical expeditions with this brilliant student, George Washington Carver. And it was George Washington Carver who instilled in that boy the love for plants and the vision for what could happen for humanity if plants were taken care of just in the right way. And it was George Washington Carver who pointed a 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life into a specific direction long before he ever became vice president of the United States, with all the power that entails. So maybe it was George Washington Carver that should have been the person of the week, right? Unless, you know this is coming, unless there was this farmer from Diamond, Missouri, which is just south of Joplin. His name was Moses. And Moses didn't believe in slavery. That made him a target, he and his family, a target for a group down there called Quantrill's Raiders, who terrorized the area by burning homes and farms and killing people. And sure enough, one cold January night, Quantrill's Raiders came into the area of Moses' farm. They burned the barn and they shot several people. They dragged off a woman by the name of Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her little baby son, George. Now, Mary Washington was a friend of Moses' wife. Her name was Susan. And so Susan was crushed by what had happened, and she instantly did everything she could at that moment to connect with as many farms as they could. By the way, before email and before the phones and all of those things. But she got the word out, and with enough time, they actually figured out where these bandits were and set up a meeting between Moses and the leader of the Quantrill's Raiders. And so in the middle of the night, Moses met up with all 4 of them. They were on horseback, carrying torches, flour sacks over their heads with eye holes cut out. I believe we call those bald knobbers in this part of the world. He met them there. There, Moses traded the only horse he had left on their farm for what the outlaws threw him in a dirty sack, burlap sack. And as the raiders thundered off, Moses fell to his knees. And there, alone in the winter dark, the farmer picked up the sack and opened it up, and there was a cold, naked, nearly dead little baby boy. And Moses opens up his shirt and his coat, and he puts the boy right there into his skin and covers him up. And because he's given away his horse, he walks day and night all the way back home, eventually arriving back to his wife, Susan. And the very next day, the 2 of them committed to raise this tiny little human, and that to each of them, they would do everything they could to care for him so that he could have a life. And they promised that boy an education to honor his mother, Mary, who valued education, Mary, who was already dead. And that night, they gave that baby their own name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver became the parents raising George Washington Carver. So when you think about it, maybe it was a farmer from Diamond that saved 2 billion people, or actually his wife Susan, who was the one that went into action. Maybe. Or, this story can go on and on, can't it? Exactly who is it that saves billions of lives? Is there a specific person we could point to? You see, I believe in this church that today is a time, a marker in time, where we can embrace this idea of being a community that loves God and loves other people. And by loving other people, individual people one at a time, we may actually do something that will change their world or change our community or change our world. I believe it. What would it look like? Well, it looks like this. Here's what I know. I know that somewhere out there's a middle-aged man who spent much of his adult life rejecting the faith of his youth. And he's going to meet one of you at work or at a social event, and you're going to get to know him because you're just that sort of person. You're a loving person, and you're going to tell him a little bit about your community here. And because he trusts you, he's going to walk into this space, or he's going to log online, and he's possibly going to hear a message that for the very first time will allow him just enough room for the belief that God may be real, and something will begin to change his heart. I know that somewhere out there is a young woman, and I know this is true because I've seen it in my own family. A young woman who was raised in the church, who then comes out as gay, and her parents reject her. And because of that rejection, it will push her away to the point where her newfound friends or her peer group become her family. Even though the relationship with her parents is strained, she still tries to connect with them, but doesn't agree with anything that the church that they've raised her in that justifies that rejection. Doesn't believe in anything about that. But some of you one day, because you're great people, you're going to be a friend, and you're going to tell them about this community that not just accepts but affirms, that celebrates who they are. And so one day she'll take a chance. She's going to enter into this place, or again online, with some strangers that might even be stranger than her, but that are going to love her and show her she's accepted and welcomed, and learn her name and learn her pronouns. And not because it's some political agenda, but because you actually love people. And because of that human decency, their life will start to reconnect with the well of life. And I also know that somewhere out there's a woman who lives mostly alone, that her outings are not as regular as they used to be, because ever since her husband died, her primary way of experiencing the outside world, especially since COVID, has become through the internet. And one day a friend tells her that, hey, I'm part of this church, and while they don't have the most sophisticated online presence, we are online, and you might want to check this out. And they do. And they see other people checking it out, and there's something in that connects with them. And they find a way to do a Zoom class from time to time and meet more people. And somehow, some way, this woman's world that used to be just her living room and an internet connection becomes just a little bit larger. I know. It looks like, because out there's also a family, a young family. And I got to tell you that between kids and work and school and everything it takes to keep a household overwhelmed, they're tired. And even though life is busy, they're lonely. And one day they walk into this place, and they feel an invitation and a warmth. And although they're apprehensive, they take a risk. And when they arrive, they see a community that cares about children. They see a community that will actually speak children's language, that won't be afraid to take times in worship and do small little things that for many of us would say that's beneath us. No, they'll see that we start to speak their language, and their young daughter is eventually going to make a friend here. And because of that, they won't feel so alone in this world, and they'll discover something that starts to lead them towards life. I mean, imagine somewhere out there. Last week, I ended our message with a story about Lifeboat 14 from the sinking of the Titanic. And so today I wanted to finish up with another story. In a similar theme around lifeboats and saving lives. It's a parable. It says, on a dangerous seacoast where shipwrecks often occurred, there was once this crude little life-saving station. And the building was just a hut, and there was only one boat, but the few devoted members kept a constant watch over the sea. And with no thought of themselves, they went out day and night, tirelessly searching for the lost. Some of those who were saved, and various others in the surrounding area, they wanted to become associated with this new station. And they gave their time, and they gave their money and their effort to support its work. New boats were bought, and new crews were trained, and the little life-saving station grew, and lives were saved. And some of the members of the Life Saving Station, though, were unhappy that the building was so crude and so poorly equipped. And so they felt that they wanted to make a more comfortable place so that those who are saved in the refuge would have a more comfortable place to be. And so they replaced the emergency cots with actual beds, and they put better furniture in the enlarged building. And now this Life Saving Station, man, it was what it needed to be, and it became popular. So popular that it became also a gathering place for its members. And they decorated it beautifully because they loved that sort of place. And now fewer members became interested in actually going on life-saving missions, so they hired people to come and to do the work of saving people with the lifeboats. And the life-saving motif remained in the club's decorations, and there was a liturgical lifeboat in their main room where their initiations were held. And about this time, a large shipwreck happened right off the coast. And the hired crew brought in boatloads of people, half drowned, cold, naked. They were dirty and they were sick, and the beautiful club was in chaos. So, the property committee, the trustees committee, they held a drive to create showers outside the building so that people could make sure they were clean before they came in. After all, we loved our space. And at the next meeting, they were split among club members. Most of the members wanted to stop the club's life-saving activities as being unpleasant and a hindrance to the normal social life of the club. And some members insisted upon life-saving ministries as their primary purpose, and they pointed out that they were called a life-saving station. But they were finally voted down and told that if they wanted to save lives, which is well and good, they need to do it elsewhere, and so they did. Another life-saving station popped up down the coast. Years went by, and the new station experienced the same problems the first one had. It evolved into a club, and then yet another life-saving station was founded, and then another, and then another. History continued to repeat itself. And if you go to that seacoast today, you will find a number of exclusive clubs along the shore. Shipwrecks are still frequent in those waters, but most people just swim for their lives. You see, this parable, kind of downer, right? This is not the way you're supposed to end a message. This parable, it's not original to me. It's been shared for decades in a variety of different ways and with different organizations and especially churches, so much so that I got to tell you, I could not figure out where it originated. But the imagery of the story is so true. And I've seen it time and time again with churches. It's a cautionary tale to not forget your mission and why you are there and what your purpose is, not to forget the reason you exist in the first place. And for us, it's a reminder to make this mission of being a community of people that first and foremost love God and love other people, all about who we are. That's it. Because if we don't cling to a mission and make it our primary focus, then we're going to become irrelevant, voiceless, and leaving people in peril. You see, I believe that what we do matters, that people matter, that you matter, that matter matters, by the way. And I believe that what we'll do will change the course of history. It might not be for billions, but you never know. I believe it'll happen. And I got to tell you, it's a hard job. It's an uncomfortable job because it will use you in ways that you are not comfortable with, but it's a grand job. And it may wear you out, but it also may invigorate you. And often, you know what? You're never going to see the full result of what you do. So we may never see the life that was changed or freed or given meaning or find purpose or direction or friendship. But I believe that doing that will change somebody's future for the best, or dozens or hundreds or thousands, or why not billions? I'm inviting you to be a part of that mission of changing the world as a community that what? Loves God and loves people. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.